Hey, welcome to Firescale Audiobooks. If you enjoy our audiobooks, please consider subscribing to the channel. Also, feel free to share your review in the comments section below.
After Serafina had her one-on-one with Emma, much of the hostility in her eyes had disappeared. While she still wasn't sure about Eric's trustworthiness or if he had messed with Emma's mind somehow, she just had to go with her gut at some point. Emma immensely enjoyed the meal as she ate with relish, causing Serafina to become curious and eat a few bites as well, and then a few more. She looked at Eric with surprise at his apparent skill as a cook. Eric just ate in silence with a small smile. While he certainly could be considered a decent cook, most praise should be for the ingredients, as they were simply of higher quality than you could find anywhere on Earth. Back on Sol, Alora certainly wasn't going to do something so mundane as cooking food, especially since she didn't really need food anyway. So Eric had little choice but to learn how, assuming he ever wanted a decent meal. When they were done eating, Eric turned to Serafina. "Feel free to make yourself at home in one of the bedrooms, but don't get any ideas. I don't sleep much." Serafina scoffed, as if insulted. "If I want to do anything, I'll do it to your face. Don't insult me." She glanced at Emma. "Will you be all right, Emma?" The nutritious and Ethereum-filled food had perked Emma up a little, but she still looked exhausted as she smiled at Serafina with tired eyes and nodded. Serafina then gave Eric one last look of warning, likely telling him not to try anything with Emma, and then went to find herself a room. With Serafina gone, Eric turned to Emma. "Are you ready to talk about why you don't seem to be getting any sleep? You know this is necessary if you want to help Emily." Emma looked a little uncomfortable, even as she nodded. I know. It's just you'll think I'm weird." Eric gave her a smile he hoped was comforting. "I've seen plenty of strange things in my life. You won't surprise me. And even if you do, what does it matter? Either way, you're stuck with me for the next 10 years. We might as well get to know each other." Emma still looked uncomfortable because trusting Eric with this would put her in a very vulnerable position. But as all her interactions with Eric in the last 2 days flashed by her eyes, she decided to trust him. After all, she wanted to save her sister, which meant she had to sleep. Besides, Eric was right. If she were to spend the next 10 years with this guy, she would need to trust him eventually. So she nodded with slightly hesitant determination. "Hey, all right, I'll show you." Having said so, she stood up and moved out of the room with Eric following her, curiosity etched on his face. They went to the upper floor and eventually arrived in front of a door. Emma gulped and went through it, Eric hot on her heels. On the other side was what likely used to be a very girly bedroom, with various plush toys, many pillows, a large princess bed, and pink colors abounding. Yet it now looked much more dreary, with the pink colors having grayed while the plushies and pillows had been thoroughly destroyed by moths and perhaps even other creatures. Emma had a nervous smile on her face as she looked at the large, handsome, heavily armored man standing in her room. You're the first man besides my father who's been in here. I have to say, I never imagined the first other man to wear menacing black armor." Eric grinned at her, wiggling his eyebrows suggestively. "I can take it off if you like." Naturally, Emma immediately thought back to this morning as her cheeks flushed, but she quickly shook her head. No, that's fine." Eric chuckled. "As you wish. So, show me why we are here." Emma nodded and gulped again before she walked to a drawer and took out some rope. She walked back to Eric with the rope in her hand as she fidgeted nervously with small tears in her eyes and tried to find the right words. For years, Emily has been tying me up at night, and sometimes even during the day if something was happening, like 2 days ago." Despite her determination to help her sister, her eyes now showed resentment as she continued. "I always hated it. Not the tied-up part per se, but the loneliness, the darkness, and the oppressive, evil feeling in that study. But after so many years, I seem to be incapable of falling asleep without being restrained." She fell quiet then, clearly both ashamed and humiliated at confessing all this to a man she barely knew. But what else could she do? At least she felt like she could trust Eric. While Eric inwardly felt surprised at her revelation, he also knew that he couldn't let it show, as Emma was already feeling vulnerable, and he wouldn't give her a reason to think he thought of her as weird. Eric hunched down a little to put his face at the same height as hers, since he was easily 30 centimeters taller, and grabbed her by the chin, forcing her to look into his eyes despite her efforts at trying to avoid it. Your life has been hard. It's only normal if you pick up some quirks along the way. But you know you'll have to learn how to sleep normally again eventually, right? Emma nodded timidly, yet happy he didn't condemn her straight away. I know. But Emily can't wait. Releasing her chin but remaining hunched, he looked at her seriously. All right. So what do you need from me? Emma took a deep breath and closed her eyes before she shoved the ropes towards Eric. Her following words said so rapidly it almost sounded like a single word. I want you to tie me up and let me sleep next to you in this room, so I don't feel alone or in the dark. A/N. If the title hasn't betrayed it yet, nothing happens with Emma in this chapter. Just to get that out of the way. Eric set out to restrain Emma as comfortably as he could while constantly eyeing her in case she wanted to back out. He wasn't going to insult her conviction by constantly asking if she was really all right with this, especially not since he was enjoying himself, but he could at least keep a close eye on her. Her arms he tied together in a light harness behind her back before snaking the rope around her medium-sized but perky chest, fastening her harness, while her legs he merely tied together by her ankles. When that was done, he crouched beside her. Are you comfortable? Do you need a gag as well? Emma looked embarrassed, but seeing how Eric was still treating her with care, she calmed down quickly despite her red face. I feel like you've done this before. Not that I have any experience with it outside of my sister's work. But yes. A gag too, please. I need it to be as close to what my sister did as possible. Just don't ignore me or leave me alone in the dark. Eric nodded seriously before he gagged her mouth. Now lying completely immobile and silenced, she looked at Eric with a little anxiety, wondering what he would do now. The man in question kept looking at Emma, making her feel seen and not ignored, while he took off his armor and adorned some simple clothing he had stored away in the storage compartment. The brief glimpse of Eric's nakedness made Emma blush deeper, but she didn't take her eyes off him as a strange feeling of excitement filled her. Continuing to keep his eyes on Emma, Eric walked around the bed and took his place on the other side of it while Emma wriggled her body to turn around. Exhaustion was still apparent on Emma's face, but the situation was still a little too stimulating for her to fall asleep. Eric looked at her and spoke with a commanding voice. I'm going to pull you closer to me now, okay? Feeling a little intimidated, Emma gulped a little but nodded, which Eric thought was adorable. He encircled her body with his powerful left arm as he pulled her closer, resting her head on his shoulder. It was slowly getting darker outside, and with no light in this room, the same was happening there, causing Emma to squirm a little. She may not be alone now, but she still didn't like the dark much. Seeing this, Eric held up his hand in front of Emma. Suddenly, a small ball of lightning began to fizzle and crack above his hand, causing Emma's anxiety to spike at first, but then a seal of ice began to form over the ball until it was wholly encased. Eric threw the ball towards the ceiling, where a small pillar of ice had formed, which the ball attached itself to as it started to spread a soft, beautifully flickering light over the room. Simple things like these were possible even without similar spells, as it was just some cantrips and pure elemental energy. Emma would have smiled gratefully if she hadn't been gagged while she looked at the trapped lightning with wonder. They lay there for a few more minutes before Emma felt the last of her anxiety drain away. All she felt now was Eric's slow breaths, his powerful, steady heartbeat, and the familiarity of being tied up while lacking the fear and despair of being alone and in the dark. A few moments later, she drifted off into a deep sleep. Eric still didn't need much sleep, however, so he decided to take this time to study his new ice affinity glyph and rune. He hoped to create seconds of these as soon as possible so he could start attempting to combine his ice and lightning affinities. His thoughts drifted into meditation as the intricacies of his imprinted marks appeared before his mind's eye, allowing him to explore them. Yet, before he got very far, he suddenly felt Allura leave his body and a weight appear on his crotch. He sighed in faked resignation as he opened his eyes, only to see a naked Allura with her crimson hair in a ponytail and her green eyes twinkling with mischief. She was naturally in her larger form as she sat on his crotch with a lusty grin on her face. "You just can't help yourself, can you?" he said rhetorically, with a grin to match the one Alora had. Alora giggled playfully. "Come now, Eric. You can't expect me to ignore this situation. I know you won't do anything to that woman, but—" She leaned closer and whispered in his ear, "I know her presence excites you." She wiggled her tight ass against his bulge. "In fact, I can feel it straight through this tiny fabric." Knowing it was useless to deny her claims, and not really feeling the desire to anyway, Eric thrust his hips up a little, causing Alora to moan softly as Eric whispered back, "Well, what are you going to do about it then, huh?" Hearing his implied acceptance, Alora shuffled down Eric's body, her eyes sparkling with mischief and lust, while Eric took a look at the girl still wrapped up in his left arm and resting against his body to make sure she was still asleep. While doing this and that with Alora, as Emma lay there, tied up and asleep, wasn't technically betraying her trust. He doubted the girl herself would see it that way if she woke up. He was pulled out of his thoughts when he felt his dick being freed from its confines, followed by a soft, wet tongue traveling across it, sending a tingle up his spine as he heard Alora giggling. "Let's wake up this big monster of yours, shall we?" Eric groaned as Alora kept licking him, slowly making him transition from half-mast to raging boner until his massive 9 inches saluted the heavens. He then felt his dick being swallowed by the trained throat of his beloved partner as her skilled tongue swirled around him, sending more and more shivers up his spine. A less experienced man would have blown his load in mere seconds from Alora's ministrations while being convinced she had been doing this all her life with as many partners as days. Yet Eric knew that his was the only cock ever to enter any part of her, and it made this feeling all the better. While he couldn't move much, as he didn't want to wake up Emma, he did use his free right arm to prop up his head, so he could relax while having a good look at Alora as she satisfied both their lusts. His lips curled into a grin as he enjoyed the combination of a pretty, trusting young girl's tight body pressed against his side, while his wicked little ember swallowed his dick with immense skill. It appeared Alora wouldn't quit until she got a belly full of Eric's load, as she continued to suck him off while her hand had long since traveled down to her own cave of wonders and furiously worked its little pearl. Alora sighed exaggeratedly, but still relented as she waved her hand, causing a thin layer of dark green light to cover Emma. "There. Neither sound nor movement will affect her sleep now." She stuck out her tongue cutely. Spoil sport. Afterwards, she was about to slide Eric inside her when she suddenly thought of something and got an idea. If Emma weren't in the way, Alora would have long since transitioned this to a 69 position. As Eric lay there enjoying this, groaning softly in an effort not to wake up Emma, it took Alora no more than 5 minutes to finish Eric off. When she noticed he was close, she moved her upper body to be in line with her own throat and thrust herself forward with a lustful grin, managing to swallow his entire 9 inches despite her small stature. Feeling her soft and tight throat all around his cock and seeing the bulge in her throat were the last straws for Eric as he began pumping his white cum straight into her stomach, while he and Alora kept looking into each other's eyes with lustful glints. When he was spent, Alora pulled herself free and grinned as she licked her lips. "Delicious." Eric chuckled. "I'll take your word for it." Alora crawled back up his body until her pussy was rubbing against his member, making it take no more than a few seconds for Eric to be rearing to go once again. There were more benefits to having a rune-bound body besides fighting power. As Alora put her hands on Eric's chest and rose up to slide her slit over his raging dick while droplets of her own need dripped down, she looked at the girl next to him and grinned. What do you think she'd do if she woke up now, huh? Squirm of the bed? Or continue to watch in fascinated silence? Eric shook his head with a smile. Maybe we'll find out one day, but let it not be today. You know we need her well rested, so make sure she doesn't wake up, all right? A wicked grin appeared on her face, and Eric immediately knew she was going to make trouble for someone, possibly him. Alora flew up and headed for the room's door, where she began to draw a symbol on the floor. As she did so, Eric could feel her accessing his lightning affinity, which she could do in small doses, just enough to draw the occasional lightning sigil. He could stop her from doing so, but he started to understand what she wanted and didn't intend to spoil her fun. It took her about 10 minutes to finish, but when she was done, she quickly flew back to Eric with an excited smile and took her seat on top of him, quickly making Eric hard again before she began to slowly slide him inside her, swallowing Eric's stick with her slit. Eric saw inch by inch disappearing into Alora's sopping wet and tight pussy as her stomach began to bulge, and his dick felt like hands of suede were massaging it on all sides. Eric groaned while Alora moaned, both lost in the ecstasy of the first penetration of the night, needing a few moments to get used to the feeling again. When Eric was fully sheathed inside, Alora huffed and puffed, likely caused by the feeling of immense fullness. While she was adjusting herself to Eric's massive length, the man himself used his right hand to caress the bulge in her stomach with a smirk before he traveled upwards and began to play with her full yet firm breasts. Alora's ever-present playful smirk was getting challenged as she tried to deal with a combination of her stuffed pussy and Eric going to town on her breasts and nipples. But it took no more than a few moments for her to pull herself together. She now breathed normally once again, even if she still moaned softly while Eric cupped her breasts. She said, slightly panting, "Last time you did all the work. Now let me." Continuing to grope her breast, Eric grinned. "Far be it from me to argue." So Alora began to move, slowly at first but faster as time passed, while the couple felt soft pleasure coursing through them. Eventually, she made an offhand remark that would cause her some trouble, and not for the first time. Her panting voice came out between pleasure-filled moans despite her continuous display of a confident smile. "You know, this girl is kind of like a chain holding you down. Chain may not be my preferred method of having you, but at least it prevents you from doing something stupid like trying to wipe the smile off my face." While Emma wouldn't wake up from movement or sound anymore, she might still wake up from a change in physical contact, so Eric still preferred not to move from his spot. Eric grinned. "Here it comes. The inevitable challenge. You know I can do that perfectly well from down here, right?" As Alora's green eyes twinkled in amusement, she answered, "I'd like to see you try. How about a bet?" "Usual stakes." Eric laughed confidently. "When was the last time you even won a bet made during sex?" They often made bets with each other, always with the same stakes, and while they had both won and lost their fair share, Alora was on a bit of a losing streak when it came to sex bets. Coincidence, overconfidence, or a purposeful display of lust? Not even Eric knew. Regardless, he enjoyed himself. Alora moaned loudly as Eric once again bottomed out in her, and his dick pressed against her womb. "That's HNGH besides the point. Deal or not?" Eric chuckled. "Far be it from me to stop you from playing a losing bet. You're on." As he said so, he snaked his hand down to Laura's waist and grabbed her waist before he slowly began pumping upwards to meet her downward thrusts. It was a good thing Alora had used her magic on Emma. Otherwise, this would have surely woken her up. Alora didn't seem impressed, however. She moaned a little louder from a combination of light, aching, and numbing pleasure as Eric hit her womb, but otherwise kept staring at him in defiance, her confident smile still a prominent feature on her face. But Eric wasn't deterred. Despite having very little room to work with, Eric managed to continually increase his speed until Alora had a small orgasm, causing her pussy to spasm around Eric's dick, massaging and pressuring it, causing Eric to come close to finishing. Still, he managed to just barely hold on. Unfortunately, despite shortly wavering, Alora's smile was still very much present. But Eric had expected that. After all, this was just the first attack. As he continued moving, he introduced the method by which he would make Alora's smile crumble. He touched one of his lightning runes, and suddenly, Alora yelped as low static began to spread all over Eric's dick, stimulating every single nerve ending in her pussy. Meanwhile, he moved his hand from Alora's hip back to her breasts as lightning began to dance on his fingertips as well. Under Alora's loud, half-pained, half-pleasured moans, Eric groped her breasts and tweaked her nipples as low-level lightning made her head spin and her muscles twitch. But at this point, his goal was essentially reached as he continued to thrust hard for a long time. even as low electricity ravaged Alora's body, causing her to scream in lust, pleasure, pain, and eventually orgasm after orgasm, making her spasm around Eric's dick as he began to lose himself in the pleasure as well. Her smile was still there, but the confidence was long gone, as all that was left was pleasure without thoughts. She wasn't even moving anymore, as her upper body had completely sagged down and now rested on Eric's broad chest, while his right hand was now on her tight ass as he continued to thrust with a lustful grin, despite already having one. It took another of Alora's orgasms, soaking Eric's lower body and the bed in various fluids, before Eric was ready to blow his load into her womb, which he did with great relish as he groaned loudly and unconsciously pulled Emma closer to him. Luckily, the exhausted girl slept deeply and didn't wake up. As Eric emptied himself inside his beloved partner, Alora shook and trembled with a silly expression on her face. When it was over, they both finally completely relaxed, with Alora lying sprawled over Eric's chest while he just sagged into the bed. With a slurping sound, he pulled himself out of Alora and grinned victoriously at her. "Looks like I won, huh?" Slurring her words a little from her still pleasure-soaked brain, Alora answered, "Fuck you. Why? You play unfair." But she would find no mercy from Eric. No rules were made. Besides, you know as well as I do that you fully expected to lose this bet. You just wanted me to go all out. Regaining her grin somewhat, Alora said, "I can neither confirm nor deny that last part. But fine. You win, Master." That's right, the loser of their bets had to call the other Master or Mommy, depending on who lost, for a week. Sometimes, these bets overlapped, and they both had to call the other by their respective titles, which would have probably confused outsiders about their exact relationship. But in the end, the title was just that, a title. The bet didn't involve actually obeying the other, as they were still loving partners with equal say. It was just a way to make things more fun and exciting for them. And if outsiders did hear them, what did they care? The only people that mattered in the end were the two of them. Hearing her acknowledge his victory, Eric chuckled and patted her head. He truly loved this side of Alora, how she didn't care about what they called each other or who overheard them. She didn't care if others would think she was a servant, because she simply didn't care about those others. Even if she had to call him Master for a week, she wasn't bothered because she knew their relationship hadn't changed. It wasn't that easy for Eric the first time he lost a bet and had to call Alora Mommy for a week, but eventually he, too, adopted the same cavalier attitude about it as Alora had. That said, he still preferred winning over losing. Having Alora call him Master was always exhilarating, even if he didn't want her to actually be a servant. Speaking of not caring about other people, now that things have finally quieted down, Eric suddenly heard some muffled sounds from the direction of the door as both Alora and he turned their heads towards it with the same teasing grin. What they saw was Serafina, gagged and suspended in the air, held up by chains of lightning that coiled around her sinful, naked body. Looking at the enraged, suspended beauty, Eric spoke up, grinning. "Why, Serafina, how nice of you to join us. You look beautiful, by the way. Listen, I hope you didn't think I was doing anything untoward with Emma." The burning fury in her eyes told him that was exactly what she was thinking. And he wasn't surprised, considering Serafina knew nothing of Alora, and her screams of ecstasy likely echoed through the entire house. He then indicated towards the short, winged beauty on his chest, who was looking at Serafina with playful sadism twinkling in her eyes. "Have you met my partner, by the way? She's the one who made your current cage. Her name is Alora. Anyway, since you barged into our room like this, I'm afraid we'll have to punish you a little by leaving you up there for the night. But don't let that stop you from getting some rest, all right?" He smirked as he said that. Eric was perfectly aware that the low-static, constantly prickling Serafina's skin would make it impossible for her to rest. And since Alora was technically a third rank, even if she didn't have any offensive magic besides sigils, there was no way Serafina would be breaking out of that. Leaving Serafina to her fate, he pulled Alora closer and whispered in her ear, "Clean us up and put some clothes on us, okay?" Alora giggled, "Fine." She snapped her fingers, and a green wave washed over them, spreading outwardly. When a wave was gone, They were both as clean as could be, with comfortable clothes on their bodies. Eric gave Alora a deep kiss, and then she laid down on his right side, resting her head on his shoulder, much like Emma was doing on the other side. They both closed their eyes but didn't go to sleep, as neither of them really needed much of it. Instead, they both began exploring their runes or glyphs and advancing in power, as Eric had originally planned. Meanwhile, Serafina continued looking at this scene with burning fury. At least at first. As the night went on, she grew more desperate, and the fury in her eyes slowly drained away, replaced by regret over assuming the worst and a desire to be freed. It was a whole 10 hours later before Emma finally began to stir. Including the time Eric had spent having sex with Alora, Emma had slept for at least 11 hours, making up for much of the fatigue which had ravaged her body. Feeling the ropes, she had a short moment where she feared that her newfound freedom had all been a dream. But when she opened her eyes and looked at Eric's wide chest next to her, the memories of last night came back to her, before sighing in relief. However, she did a quick mental check of her body to make sure she didn't suddenly feel a strange pain in her lower parts. But when she couldn't detect anything, she released that sigh through her gag as her trust in Eric began to rise to immense levels. Noticing movement next to him, Eric halted the exploration of his runes and glyphs to look beside him with a smile. "Good morning, Emma. Do you know you've slept for at least 11 hours? I can't help but assume you got a good rest." Seeing her mumble something with happy eyes, Eric quickly removed her gag, allowing Emma to speak up with a cheery voice, very different from the tired and somewhat defeated voice he'd gotten used to from her. "I slept very well." Then she turned her head away from Eric's eyes and seemed a little embarrassed. Thank you for helping me and not taking advantage." Grinning, Eric took Emma's chin in his hand and made her look into his eyes, causing him to notice the small tears of gratitude sparkling in them. "You don't need to worry when you're with me. Just serve me well according to our deal, and I will never harm or break my word to you." Emma nodded with a happy smile. "I'll do whatever you require of me, sir." Eric was surprised at the way she addressed him, but didn't correct her. Clearly, this night had an enormous impact on the girl. Yet when he thought of what he did with Alora last night and the vampire woman who was still suspended just behind Emma's back, he couldn't help but chuckle. "I hope you'll still think that later." Emma looked confused, but then suddenly heard some muffled sounds behind her and wriggled her body to turn around. Still suspended by chains of lightning, Serafina had a pleading look in her eyes as she tried to get Emma's attention. Seeing what was behind her, Emma's thoughts briefly halted as she had trouble catching up to what was happening while a single syllable escaped her lips. Meanwhile, Eric had decided to relieve Emma of her bonds, so she was free to stretch her arms while she turned around and looked at Eric with uncertainty. "Yes, sir? Can I ask what's going on with Serafina?" Eric looked at her with interest, surprised she didn't immediately try to help Serafina and intended to test her conviction. "What if I say no?" She seemed to hesitate a little, but then steeled herself. "Then that's fine, sir." Eric could still see the uncertainty in her eyes. However, it seemed Emma wasn't very happy about the situation, but would still choose him over Serafina. Meanwhile, Alora had also stirred and propped herself up on her elbow as her heavy chest swayed in the morning air. "Oh, look at you being a good little girl." Apparently only now noticing Alora's presence, Emma yelped, Good morning, ma'am." Alora grinned at Emma like a cat, looking at her new toy. "Ma'am, I can live with that. But for now, I'm going back home." At those words, she disappeared into a cloud of light specks and entered Eric's body. While Emma had seen this before, Serafina looked on with astonishment, finally understanding where this woman had been all this time. Eric then got up from the bed and walked towards Serafina, who seemed to look at Eric with a strange combination of fury and defeat as she could feel his lustful eyes wander across her naked body. After he had gotten his eye full, he used Alora's link to the sigil to remove the strands of lightning, keeping Serafina's mouth sealed. "How are you feeling?" First, stretching her jaw to get the stiffness out of it, she then looked at Eric with uncertain fury. Fuck you." Eric's lips curled into a wolfish grin. "Come now, Serafina." You barged into the room without so much as a thought. Did you really expect us not to take precautions? Seeing no reaction from her as she continued to stare at him with fury, Eric just shrugged and walked past her. Oh well. Come on, Emma. Let's get some breakfast. Emma gulped a little with uncertainty, but then walked after Eric while looking apologetically at Serafina. Why? Yes, sir. Serafina quickly yelled after him. Wait. Why, you can't leave me here. She had been trying all night to break loose, but to no avail. Now, her body ached and wanted release from the strain and constant electric stimulation. Unable to look behind her, she feared Eric had actually left her until she heard a voice. Oh, I suppose I could free you, if you ask nicely and apologize for barging in. At first, she sighed in relief that he was still there, but hearing his demands, she became stubborn again. I will ask nicely, but I won't apologize for trying to save Emma from you, even if it appears to already be too late. Seeing the pleading look in Emma's eyes, and honestly being unable to find anything wrong with her actions, Eric sighed. Fine, go on then. Serafina groaned for a moment, but eventually relented. Will you please release me? Eric grinned in response, and snapped his fingers, causing the sigil to disappear and Serafina to land on her feet while swaying a little before she quickly and gracefully found her balance and stretched her body under a relieved moan. Meanwhile, Eric ignored Alora's mocking of his supposed bleeding heart. Serafina turned around and saw Eric look at her still naked body with a lustful smirk, while Emma looked embarrassed and stammered. Yes, Serafina. But the vampire held up her hand to stop Emma. It's fine, Emma. You and I knew each other a long time ago, and I had more to do with your sister, anyway. You made your choice, and I don't blame you for it. I just hope you made the right one. Having said her piece, she threw one last resentful look at Eric before slipping past them and started walking towards the room she had picked for herself the night before without ever covering up her nakedness. Clearly, she was either too prideful to show shame or just very comfortable with her body. As Eric enjoyed the view of her spectacular, swaying ass, he heard her voice again. I'm going to put on my clothes. I'll meet you two downstairs. When they reached the living room, Emily was already there waiting for them. Where she had spent the night was a secret known only to Alora. Eric quickly pulled some food from his storage and prepared breakfast for the both of them until Serafina eventually joined them. The vampire woman still looked angry at Eric, but whenever she thought he wasn't looking, her gaze turned to one of hunger, clearly desiring some of his blood. She would have to ask, though, as Eric certainly wasn't going to simply offer. He didn't want her to be some kind of slave to his blood. Still, she did need to learn respect and a desire to follow him, as an insider in the council was necessary for his and Alora's plans. But her need wasn't that high yet, so she just suffered her desire in silence for now. After breakfast, it was finally time to get started on awakening Emma. They were currently in the living room. Emily was standing dull-eyed with her back against the wall. Eric was lounging on one of the sofas. Serafina sat to the right of him, and in the middle of the room was Emma, and, floating in front of her, Alora. Since she had, somewhat reluctantly, agreed to help the sisters, she would naturally see it through herself. That being said, her disinterested look spoke volumes about her enthusiasm. However, she did explain a little about Emma's condition and the awakening process. Right, let's get this over with. Typically, awakening happens when etherium first flows into a person's body, forcing the etherium storage to appear, which is a metaphysical organ without a specific location in the body. For people already living in an etherium-rich environment, this gradual process starts at birth and finishes at the age of 10. At this point, they form their first glyph. On the other hand, people not living from birth in such an environment will have an accelerated growth process of this organ, which can cause the body to combust, as many people here on Earth noticed. You, however, have something akin to a genetic defect where the etherium storage starts forming at a slower rate, no matter what age you are, which means that in 3 years, you would have finished creating your storage and been like everybody else. She puffed up her chest in pride. Luckily for you, I'm perfectly capable of accelerating the growth of this organ to be finished in a day. Then she shrugged. Unluckily for you, there's a small chance that this accelerated growth will still cause you to combust. I'm only mentioning this because Master asked me to. I'm perfectly confident in preventing the combustion, but this is your last chance to back out. Hearing her call him Master according to their bet made Eric grin, while Alora completely ignored the event as if it were normal, simply because she didn't really care what she called Eric. No one else in the room reacted to it, though, as none of them were sure about the relationship between Alora and Eric in the first place. In response to Alora's words, Emma looked at the one person in the room she now put most of her trust in, Eric. Seeing Emma's doubts, Eric smiled. Alora has never let me down when it comes to anything magical, so if she says she has complete confidence, then so do I. That said, it's your choice. But if you don't, we could do only so much for Emily. We could wait 3 years, of course, but since the corruption has already gotten this far, it will only worsen, even without the sigil, and possibly become impossible to cure. Emma nodded at his words, panned her gaze towards Alora, and nodded again with as much determination as she had in her body. Alora grinned. Seeing someone like you, ready to risk it all to save her sister, almost makes me convert to the Radiant Glade's touchy-feely crap. Immediately, a smirk appeared on Eric's face. Oh. Without turning her head, Alora pointed a finger at Eric. Shut it, you. I said almost. Eric blinked in mock surprise. I'm sorry, who's this you person? Sighing, Alora turned to Eric. I meant shut your damn trap, Master. While this short interaction confused the room even more about their relationship, Alora simply turned back to Emma. She raised a finger with a dark green sphere at the end. Ready? When Emma nodded, the green sphere suddenly began expanding and elongating until it was as tall and wide as she was before enveloping her. Since the Ethereum storage was a metaphysical organ without a fixed location, there was not a single point on Emma's body to interact with for this. When the enveloping was done, Alora put her outstretched hand on the dark green bubble and appeared to be concentrating. At some point, she started frowning and put her other hand on the bubble, as Eric could feel an increasing amount of energy being drained from their shared storage. Suddenly, Emily sagged down as if her strings were cut, causing Serafina to look at her with surprise before shooting Eric a look of concern. Eric shook his head. I'm not sure. Alora is concentrating, but she needed more energy than expected, so she drained Emily through their shared connection. Don't worry, she's fine. Just need some rest. Serafina frowned. She wanted to help, but Arcanist and Runebound energy was incompatible, likely because the energy used by Runebound was all generated by the Runebound themselves, while Arcanists only stored Ethereum they absorbed from the air. Luckily, it appeared Alora had enough energy in the end as she sighed, and the green bubble disappeared, showing a seemingly unharmed Emma floating in the air. Next, Emma slowly floated down to Earth and opened her mismatched green and white eyes. Immediately, she felt the same rush everyone else had felt 7 years ago and instinctively began moving her finger in the air as she drew her first glyph. Meanwhile, Alora had already disappeared into a cloud of light specks. She returned to Eric's soul, where Eric asked her what had happened. Are you all right, Alora? What just happened? He could feel Alora make a thoughtful expression. It's strange. I suspect some ancestor or ancestors of Emma had their DNA messed with, creating the defect and making it much harder for me to accelerate the Ethereum storage's growth. But I couldn't possibly tell you for what purpose this was done, if the alterations did anything else, or if the defect was intended. However, if so, it clearly failed in both Emily's and their parents' cases. Either way, this only creates more questions. The ancestor whose DNA was messed with should be very far removed. It probably happened at least 1,000 years ago. But who on Earth could possibly have the power to do something like that back then? Even if we are correct in assuming Earth has had some kind of past history with magic and Ethereum, it can't have been a mere 1,000 years ago. Not to mention that I, a third-rank fairy with extensive knowledge about bloodlines and genetics, am unable to determine precisely what these changes are supposed to do, let alone recreate it, so whoever did this was more powerful and knowledgeable than me. Eric and Alora both fell silent until Eric asked, Do you think their affinities have anything to do with this? He could feel Alora shrug helplessly. I really have no idea. It would certainly explain a lot, but also raise more questions. And we can't assume their affinities weren't caused by something else, or even just random chance. Eric sighed with exhaustion. I guess whoever did that probably also brought us back to Earth, just in time to save those sisters. Why us, though? However, Alora shook her head. It was probably more about you than me. If I had to guess, someone has plans for both you and the Ashcroft sisters. But you were accidentally teleported away, so they had to bring you back. At the same time, I am likely just a coincidence along for the ride. Eric shook his head. That's possible, yet we can't exclude other possibilities. Maybe the only reason I was useful enough to teleport back here was because of you. He sighed. But if this is all about me, then I'm just sorry I dragged you into this mess. Alora immediately and mentally smacked him on the head. Don't be an idiot. Your problems are my problems, just as my problems are your problems. Don't forget that. Eric chuckled at her reply. You're the best, Alora. Holding fast to their bet, Alora responded. And you're pretty okay too, Master. Laughing out loud now, Eric refocused on the outside world and noticed that Emma was just about finished with her glyph. After all, mental conversations were much faster than regular ones. However, Emma wasn't done yet, as she suddenly began to draw a second glyph under Seraphina's surprised gaze. Eric seemed unfazed, however, clearly having expected this. Emily was lying on one of the sofas, as Seraphina had put her to rest there. At the same time, Emma was almost finished drawing her second glyph. When she was done, her eyes shone for a moment, and she blinked before smiling excitedly. It was done. Finally, she wasn't useless anymore. She panned her sparkling, mismatched eyes towards Eric and hugged him with that same excited smile. Thank you. And please thank Miss Alora for me as well. Eric grinned at the adorable Emma and patted her head. Don't worry, she can hear everything you say. He didn't feel it necessary to mention that Alora didn't really care about Emma's gratitude. Emma stepped back and looked thoughtful for a moment before she stuck out her hand. Under the gaze of her two curious onlookers, a bright white magic circle appeared in front of her hand, casting a soft glow over Eric. Immediately, Eric knew what this did, as he felt his natural regeneration speed up to abnormal limits. He may not have any wounds to heal, but if he did, this would have immensely sped up the process. Yet, it wasn't an actual healing spell, as it merely sped up several bodily processes, but didn't stitch up any wounds by itself, which meant it had limited uses in a combat or emergency situation. That said, it was still a great spell, and he wasn't about to let Emma down as she looked at him excitedly, obviously aware of what her spell was supposed to do. So he patted her head with a smile. Good job, Emma. I told you you'd be plenty useful after you awakened. Before Emma could respond, Seraphina interjected, Wait. That affinity just now. Eric nodded in response. Yeah, it was light. The antithetical affinity to darkness. And if you're going to ask me how these two sisters ended up with those affinities, don't bother, as I have no clue either. There was no reason to mention the DNA manipulation. After all, he wasn't even sure that was the cause yet. That was indeed going to be Seraphina's next question. Still, before she could even say anything else, Eric continued. Regardless, healing corruption always works best when you use the corrupting affinities opposite, so this is good news for Emily. He then turned his attention back to Emma, who was still almost bouncing around the room with energy and only got more excited when she heard about being able to help Emily now. Eric smiled at the happy Emma. He had to admit that he really liked this adorable girl. He hoped she would be able to put her hardships behind her as soon as possible. Why don't you show us your other affinity now? Seemingly having forgotten about that due to the excitement, Emma possibly lit up even more as she suddenly stood still and pointed her hand forward again, this time causing a light green magic circle to appear. Next, green branches crashed through the room's tiled floor before they began weaving around Emma until she was entirely encased in a thick bramble of vines, branches, roots, and thorns. Emma's second affinity was nature. While light was no less rare and powerful than darkness, nature was relatively common. Maybe not as much as fire or water, but certainly no better or worse than Eric's ice or lightning. Her light affinity was the reason that Emma didn't go insane locked inside the darkness-saturated study room, while also protecting her from being enslaved by Emily's dark magic. On the other hand, her nature affinity gave her an uncanny intuition, which led to a much faster trust growth with Eric. Emily was lying on one of the sofas, as Serafina had put her to rest there. At the same time, Emma was almost finished drawing her second glyph. When she was done, her eyes shone for a moment, and she blinked before smiling excitedly. It was done. Finally, she wasn't useless anymore. She panned her sparkling, mismatched eyes towards Eric and hugged him with that same excited smile. "Thank you. And please thank Miss Alora for me as well." Eric grinned at the adorable Emma and patted her head. "Don't worry, she can hear everything you say." He didn't feel it necessary to mention that Alora didn't really care about Emma's gratitude. Emma stepped back and looked thoughtful for a moment before she stuck out her hand. Under the gaze of her two curious onlookers, a bright white magic circle appeared in front of her hand, casting a soft glow over Eric. Immediately, Eric knew what this did, as he felt his natural regeneration speed up to abnormal limits. He may not have any wounds to heal, but if he did, this would have immensely sped up the process. Yet, it wasn't an actual healing spell, as it merely sped up several bodily processes, but didn't stitch up any wounds by itself, which meant it had limited uses in a combat or emergency situation. That said, it was still a great spell, and he wasn't about to let Emma down as she looked at him excitedly, obviously aware of what her spell was supposed to do. So he patted her head with a smile. "Good job, Emma. I told you you'd be plenty useful after you awakened." Before Emma could respond, Serafina interjected, Wait. That affinity just now." Eric nodded in response. "Yeah, it was light, the antithetical affinity to darkness. And if you're going to ask me how these two sisters ended up with those affinities, don't bother, as I have no clue either." There was no reason to mention the DNA manipulation, after all. He wasn't even sure that was the cause yet. That was indeed going to be Serafina's next question. Still, before she could even say anything else, Eric continued, "Regardless, healing corruption always works best when you use the corrupting affinity's opposite, so this is good news for Emily." He then turned his attention back to Emma, who was still almost bouncing around the room with energy and only got more excited when she heard about being able to help Emily now. Eric smiled at the happy Emma. He had to admit that he really liked this adorable girl. He hoped she would be able to put her hardships behind her as soon as possible. "Why don't you show us your other affinity now?" Seemingly having forgotten about that due to the excitement, Emma possibly lit up even more as she suddenly stood still and pointed her hand forward again, this time causing a light green magic circle to appear. Next, green branches crashed through the room's tiled floor before they began weaving around Emma until she was entirely encased in a thick bramble of vines, branches, roots, and thorns. Emma's second affinity was nature. While light was no less rare and powerful than darkness, nature was relatively common. Maybe not as much as fire or water, but certainly no better or worse than Eric's ice or lightning. Her light affinity was the reason that Emma didn't go insane locked inside the darkness-saturated study room, while also protecting her from being enslaved by Emily's dark magic. On the other hand, her nature affinity gave her an uncanny intuition, which led to a much faster trust growth with Eric. Moments later, the various greenery was dispelled as they slowly disappeared back into the ground, revealing a smiling Emma, who immediately wanted to know when they could start helping Emily. "So, we can help Emily now?" Eric chuckled at her enthusiasm. "Almost. Luckily for you, Alora will do most of the actual work, while you only have to provide the light-attributed energy. Still, you will need to completely fill up your ethereal storage first. So let's teach you some of the best and safest ways to do this. I'll also teach you about arcanism in general." He turned serious. "But remember, Emma, while light corruption may sound less evil, it is no less destructive to your true personality. You might believe that light corrupts your negative emotions, just as darkness corrupts your positive emotions. But nothing could be further from the truth, as light corruption will simply wipe out all emotions instead. No powerful affinity ever has a harmless corruption effect. He pointed to Seraphina. Even she has to be careful, as gravity affinity might make her severely lethargic or depressed. This caused Seraphina to frown. Are you sure about that? Council data so far suggests that only arcanists are affected by this so-called corruption. Her statement made Eric pause. Was he sure about that? It's not like he had much experience with Runebound, and Alora protected him from corruption either way. He heard Alora speak in his head. It's possible. Arcanists and Runebound work relatively differently, after all. For Runebound, Ethereum only really modifies the body and doesn't even interact with a person's affinities. In contrast, a Runebound body's energy is different enough from Ethereum that you could even consider it something else entirely. So perhaps corruption has less to do with the affinities and more with Ethereum itself. Eric frowned, but then shook his head. In the end, this wasn't particularly important right now. He looked at Seraphina. Now that you mention it, I'm not actually sure about that. But we have different things to worry about right now. He turned back to Emma. Getting back to the point, you need to remember to always be careful. Understood? You don't want to end up like your sister. You might not start hurting her like she did to you, but at least Emily still cares about you in her own twisted way, while light corruption would cause you not to care about Emily at all anymore. Realizing the seriousness of the situation, she nodded and swore to herself to follow all of Eric's teachings and instructions. Eric smiled, feeling like he had driven his point home. Good. Let's get started then. A few hours later, at the start of the evening, they were standing in front of the door to the cellar, where Eric had first woken up 2 days ago. During this time, Eric had first spent some effort teaching Emma about some of the safest and fastest ways to absorb energy, which she had immediately put into practice. Now, her ethereal storage was stuffed, and they were ready to begin. All current inhabitants of the mansion were there, including Liam, who had spent the whole night hogtied in a cold, damp closet and was currently being dragged along the ground by Eric. A dark green sigil glowed on his chest, sealing his magic core and stopping him from casting his magic, something that was easily done for Alora since Liam was only a first-rank arcanist. His experiences during the night had made him much more compliant, as he hardly struggled anymore, and just lay there staring at the people around him with undisguised fury mixed with exhaustion. Naturally, he was going completely ignored. Meanwhile, Emily looked dull-eyed as always. Emma looked anxious, and Seraphina had a look of curiosity mixed with concern. Now that they were at the cellar door and on top of the stairs, Eric produced a small, light purple magic circle, causing a lightning spark to travel all across Liam's body, devouring the ropes that bound him. Liam looked confused. He wasn't stupid enough to think they were letting him go, but he had no idea why they brought him here and removed his bonds, either. When he noticed nothing else happened, he looked around himself warily and slowly stood up, stretching his limbs and cracking his bones after the night he had. No one there besides Eric and Alora actually knew what the exact plan was, so Emma looked at this with confused anxiety. Yet, her nearly absolute trust in Eric made her stay quiet. At the same time, Seraphina simply matched Liam's earlier look of fury with twice the intensity. Eric looked at the pasty man and couldn't help but feel some regret. Not over Liam's fate, of course, but regret that he wouldn't get to torture this pathetic little man himself. Regardless, the plan was the plan. Liam stood straight and stared at the group of people surrounding him with wariness and confusion. He didn't even try attacking, as he was perfectly aware of his sealed magic. Besides, even if he did have his magic, 3 of the people there could stomp him into the ground all by themselves. He made a last attempt to save himself by addressing Eric and carefully hiding any and all resentment, while sounding as amicable as he could. "Look, friend, I'm a little confused as to what your interest in me is. Exactly what you did to Emily, or your relationship with her and Emma, is also a mystery to me. But any animosity between us is negligible, if not entirely non-existent. Therefore, might I suggest we simply part ways here? Before anything happens that we can't take back, I have substantial power and wealth in this region, and I'm sure we can make a deal." Eric listened to Liam's words patiently as he looked at the man with amusement. Exactly what use did this man think he had for the wealth and power of a weakling? So he shrugged. No deal. Before Liam could say anything else, Eric grabbed his neck and tossed him down the stairs into the cellar. The cold, dimly lit basement, which used to be a wine cellar, echoed with the thuds and screams of Liam rolling down the concrete steps until he hit the floor, where he continued to lay groaning. Eric was grinning at the top of the stairs before stepping to the side, allowing Emily to descend into the basement. With a heavy thud, Eric closed the door behind the corrupted, doll-eyed girl before Alora suddenly appeared from a cloud of light, specks leaving Eric's body, and immediately began drawing a sigil on the basement door. Unable to contain her curiosity any longer, Emma hesitated for a moment longer before finally asking, "Sir, what's the plan exactly?" Eric turned his gaze towards Emma as an approving smile appeared on his face. Happy she was taking some initiative, he unraveled the strategy to cleanse Emily's corruption. Once Alora finished sealing the door, she'll release control of Emily. At that point, Emily will be confused, her memory of the last 2 days gone, despite finding herself back where Alora first sealed her mind. He continued, "However, that won't matter much. When Emily lays eyes on Liam and realizes she's alone with him, her corrupted mind will focus solely on Liam, the man responsible for all her troubles since the awakening. She'll be consumed by the desire to make him pay. While she vents her rage on Liam, the grip of the dark corruption will start to loosen. After all, the hatred and fear she harbors for him are the very foundations upon which the corruption has distorted her positive emotions." Eric explained further. Ordinarily, this wouldn't be enough since there are always new fears and hatreds for such corruption to attach itself to. But with your light affinity, Emma, we can cleanse the corruption before it finds another foothold. You won't need to do much, however, as Alora will be the one doing the cleansing through her connection with Emily. You only need to provide her the light-attributed energy. During his explanation, Alora had finished applying the sigil that would keep Emily locked up until the process was done. Sound still came through from the other side, however, as Liam could be heard yelling at them to let him go and threatening to hurt Emily, who appeared like she wouldn't fight back. At the same time, his intermittent groans of pain echoed off the cold walls. Then, Alora gained a malicious grin. "It's time," she said. Inside the basement, Emily's eyes started regaining their liveliness after 2 days of empty existence, as her previously slack body stance turned back to one of paranoia and hatred, ready to fight or flight at a moment's notice. Her corrupted red eyes blinked and flickered with awareness as she scanned her surroundings. Confusion clouded her expression briefly, but as her gaze fell upon Liam, who was just preparing to attack her, a sinister smile crept across her face. The hatred and paranoia within her had already begun to take control. On the other side of the door, Alora, in her small fairy form, put her tiny hands on the door and closed her eyes in concentration before she said, "Get ready to channel your energy, Emma." A little confused about what she was supposed to do exactly, she turned to Eric with anxiety on her face. He explained, "Just hold your hands on either side of Alora and channel energy from your Ethereum storage through the light affinity in your magic core, and then to your hands, just like I taught you earlier." Emma was nervous, clearly not wanting to mess anything up. Still, she did as Eric said, and soon, a light bubble formed between Emma's hands and around Alora's body. Next, a small magic circle appeared where Alora was touching the door. Meanwhile, inside the basement, and Emily, driven by dark emotions, prepared to launch a frenzied assault on Liam as her inner rage and sadism found the perfect outlet. Using tendrils of darkness to suspend a now fearfully screaming and wailing Liam in the air, she began forming various sizes of pitch-black floating bubbles. Despite still being confused about how she got into this situation, Emily didn't care as she looked at the now suspended Liam with an undisguised desire for violence and began cackling. At the same time, a sinister smile appeared on her face, a smile that grew more distorted with every word that followed. "Oh, Liam, 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 I don't know how we got into this situation, but, well, how did you put it so eloquently 7 years ago? I don't know what God or coincidence or whatever gave me this opportunity, but I'll kiss their feet in thanks. I think I finally understand the sentiment. Liam screamed when he saw the black orbs floating around him and remembered the pain from his flesh melting 7 years ago. Wait, wait. We can talk about this, Emily. I know I was wrong, but your parents and I were friends. Does that count for nothing anymore? At least give me a quick death. At this point, his fear of Emily's darkness made him prefer death over anything Emily had planned. Unfortunately, his words only angered Emily more as she screeched, "You dare speak about my parents? You putrid stain on existence?" Immediately afterwards, the first black orb approached Liam and started covering his entire body. But while Liam did scream, it seemed more fear than pain as the darkness didn't appear to hurt him. However, this didn't surprise Emily as her distorted grin remained. "My control has gotten much better than before, little stain. My darkness will only devour what I wish it to." She then waved her hand, and all the darkness on Liam's body began to move towards his hips while removing any and all clothing and hair it came across without harming the man himself. Emily also noticed the magic circle on Liam's chest and the heavy scarring from where her darkness hit him 7 years ago. However, she ignored them both, as she had other things on her mind. When everything had gathered around Liam's crotch, Emily's smile grew possibly even more sinister as she balled her fist. "Let's finish what I started back then, shall we?" Liam began to scream again, but this time it truly was from pain as the darkness began to, ever so slowly, consume his genitals. At the same time, inside Emily's mostly black soul, tiny strands of darkness began to be released. They started floating around with nothing to hold on to anymore. Yet, immediately afterwards, a bright white light entered the soul and burned the strand of darkness into nothingness. Emily noticed nothing of this as she continued to indulge in the sadistic pleasure of finally being able to unleash her wrath on the one that had haunted her for so long, even while the darkness that bound her mind began to wane. Back on the other side of the door, the people gathered there began to hear the sounds of Liam's desperate wailing and struggling. Still, no one batted an eye, not even the usually kind Emma, as she had only one thing on her mind right now: her sister. While having no idea what was happening in that basement exactly, Eric saw Emma begin to strain a little and quickly put a hand on her shoulder to give her some encouragement and send his own pure ethereal energy into her body. In this way, time began to pass quickly, as screams of agony echoed across the walls of the Ashcroft estate, while Emily's corrupted soul struggled against Emma's purifying light, pulsing with the interplay of light and darkness. The fate of the two sisters hung in the balance, and it took an hour before the screams finally started dying down. At this point, Emma was only still standing by the grace of Eric's arm around her waist. As her head hung low, her entire body trembled with effort, and all she could do was continue to keep her hands up and flood Alora with any last shred of light-attributed Ethereum she could find. But, in the end, her efforts paid off as Alora removed her hands from the door and dispelled the magic sigil before saying, "You can stop now, Emma. It's done." Hearing those words, Emma released a heavy sigh. She completely sagged into Eric's embrace, only barely holding on to her consciousness. Alora turned around and smirked at the exhausted young woman. "I admit, you impress me more and more, girl." But that was all she said, as she once again disappeared into Eric's soul, her part in all this played. With Alora gone, the remaining three individuals gazed upon the basement door with various emotions. Eric's amber eyes flickered with curiosity. Emma's mixed eyes mirrored a blend of exhaustion and anxiety, while Seraphina's crimson eyes conveyed a sense of deep concern. Since Emma could barely keep herself upright, Eric decided to take her into a princess, Carrie, as he began walking down the stone stairs into the dimly lit, silent basement that had only moments ago echoed with agonizing screams. The air hung heavy with remnants of the dark energy by which Emily had tortured Liam. When they reached the bottom and looked at the scene before them, they saw a barely recognizable clump of flesh that likely used to be Liam. Next to that stood Emily, her black hair now matching her eyes as the corrupted red had disappeared. It appeared as if Emily was staring into nothingness with tears in her eyes. When she suddenly heard a sound coming from the entrance, her head swiveled that way with caution. But when she saw an exhausted Emma being carried by a large man with piercing, amber eyes, her tears only fell faster as she cautiously met Emma's gaze. She whispered her sister's name, Emma. Seeing her big sister like this, Emma smiled as she could feel Emily had, at least somewhat, returned to normal. She asked Eric to let her go, and he did as she asked, carefully putting the tired woman on her feet. He watched as she slowly walked towards Emily. They stood facing each other now, and the silence was palpable. Eventually, Emily took a step back as if afraid of what Emma might do, or perhaps of what she might do to Emma. Emily's voice quivered, but Emma ignored her and quickly closed the distance between them before she hugged Emily, just like she had done when they were younger. Only now, Emma was crying tears of happiness. It's all right, Big Em. All that matters is that you are back to normal. I saved you. Her last words came filled with an immense amount of pride and joy. While Emily looked confused and uncertain about the whole situation, she seemed to accept Emma's explanation as fact for now and hug her little sister back with trembling arms. Why? Yeah, you did, little Em. Thank you. I'm so sore dash. But Emma stopped her again by shaking her head and covering Emily's mouth with her hand. Don't. Let's just forget what happened. You weren't yourself, and I don't blame you. While no one in that room besides Emma believed there was truly no resentment at all in the girl's heart, Emily saw the exhaustion in her sister's eyes. She decided now was not the time to argue about the past with her. She put on her best smile and looked Emma in her mismatched eyes. You look exhausted, little Em. I'm not sure what it took to save me, but go have some rest. We could talk later, okay? But Emma quickly shook her head. No, I can stay awake. I finally got you back, and no dash. She was interrupted by a dark green flash of light behind her, after which she suddenly sagged into Emily's arms. Behind her stood Eric with a serious gaze and raised hand, clearing having used Alora's magic to put Emma to sleep. There were multiple reasons they didn't use this on Emma before. For one, this kind of magic sleep, while hard to awaken from, never actually put its target into REM sleep, which limited its use for recovering from exhaustion. Another reason was that using directed and powerful magic on an unawakened was dangerous for the target. Luckily, the second reason was no longer a concern, and while the first still was, Eric realized Emma needed to be out of the room, and quick. Emily looked at Eric with a mixture of gratitude and caution as she realized what he had just done, but otherwise, she knew nothing about him. Meanwhile, Eric beckoned Serafina. Serafina, take Emma to her room and put her on her bed. I'll have a talk with Emily about the future. While the vampire woman wanted her time with Emily, she felt something strange was still going on with her old friend and decided not to argue. When she moved to Emily's side and wanted to take Emma, the pale girl looked at the vampire cautiously. While Emily seemed anxious to get rid of Emma, she was also suspicious about this unknown woman. Serafina smiled with some complex emotions as she awkwardly avoided looking into Emily's eyes. Remember what we called our club all those years ago? Women in Black. Emily now looked truly surprised. Olivia, are you expecting me to believe that? But despite the fact she suspected them from simply having read her memories, now that the possibility of this woman being Olivia was out in the open, she suddenly started recognizing some quirks and facial features of the Olivia she once knew. However, she was afraid of being misled, as paranoia was still a large part of her personality. Yet, as her hands, which had not stopped trembling since Emma hugged her, started shaking harder, she quickly shoved Emma into Serafina's arms. She growled and pointed at the clump of blackened flesh that used to be a man. If you harm her, I will make you beg to end up like that. Seeing Serafina, Nod seriously put her at ease a little as she watched with caution while the vampire woman carried Emma up the stairs with the unconscious girl's long white hair flowing behind them. When they were gone, Emily and Eric looked each other in the eyes for a moment, Eric with silent dignity and Emily with equally silent determination. Without breaking eye contact, Emily suddenly steps forward before grabbing Eric's shirt with both hands and leaning forward, finally breaking eye contact as her lower arms and forehead come to rest against his chest, a display of both vulnerability and determination. Eric looked at her display with an understanding gaze. Her entire body continued to shake as she broke the silence. I don't know who you are or how I got here. The last thing I remember before waking up in this basement was when I tried to enslave you in the same place. Before I say anything else, I want to thank you for saving Emma from me. I don't know if I could trust you with her, but I know you can't be much worse than I was. She fell silent again for a moment before she turned her head upwards with tears streaming down her cheeks as she looked into the fierce amber eyes of Eric. I know you must be at least partly responsible for giving me back a little clarity, but her voice became more desperate as her eyes showed intense struggle. You need to do more. It's not good enough. I can feel the darkness nibbling at the edges of my being, and I can only barely hold it off for now. She now almost screamed as her hands trembled with immense force, which was obviously far from enough to make Eric waver. Either do more or kill me. I can't go back to the person I was before. I won't. Clearly, the purification was far from complete or absolute, as there was still plenty of corruption left in Emily. But they had expected that and warned Emma about it as well. Yet this was worse than they expected, making Eric look at the young woman with pity as he couldn't imagine this woman's struggle. Yet, he had to disappoint and shake his head. There is nothing more I can do about your corruption for now. Only when Emma grows stronger can we, eventually, remove more of your corruption, even if we can never truly remove everything. I won't kill you, however, because Emma would never forgive me regardless of my reasons, and frankly, I care more about her than you. He shrugged. Besides, Emma will be very useful in the future, and I would prefer she serves me willingly rather than forcefully through the covenant. While normally, Emily would be happy about his admission to care about Emma and confused about what this covenant might mean. Right now, her mind was not in a stable place as she screamed at Eric with fury burning in her black eyes, even as a corrupted red flicker occasionally passed through them. Fuck you, you bastard. You can't give me a glimpse of sanity and light before letting me slip back into darkness. You can't. Do something. Suddenly, Emily heard a soft woman's voice next to her ear, a voice that, for some reason, filled her with dread as she saw flashes of herself floating in a sea of emptiness. If you can't resist the darkness, I may have a solution for you. With her nerves taut, Emily yelped in surprise, released Eric's shirt, and jumped back. Who said that? At the same time, the lingering elemental darkness in the room began to stir as Eric noticed how Emily drew power towards her hands in an instinctual desire to protect herself despite her earlier conviction to die. The same voice, obviously Alora's, sounded again as it giggled. Look at you, jumping to defend yourself. Not yet ready to die, are you? Unable to find where the voice was coming from, Emily looked at Eric with panicked eyes. Are you hearing that voice? Eric briefly considered pulling a prank on the girl by pretending not to, but quickly discarded that thought as he reminded himself not to let Alora have too much influence on his behavior. So he answered honestly with a nod. That's my partner, Alora. If you want someone to thank for your current situation, you should look to her, as she did most of the work. He chuckled softly. Don't be fooled, however. If you're looking for someone to care about you and your sister, you'd be better off with me. Emily looked relieved that she wasn't going insane, but remained on edge as she likely still associated Alora's voice with floating in an abyss of nothing. Hey, all right, so you said something about a solution? Hey, and why do I feel weird when I hear your voice? Suddenly, Eric felt Alora appear on his right shoulder in her smaller form. Emily's eyes were quickly drawn to her before Alora's giggles echoed through the basement. Because I was the one that kept your mind locked up inside itself for the last 2 days. Her green eyes sparkled with sadistic glee. I'm sure you still feel a little apprehension. Emily opened her mouth a few times as if to say something, but in the end, she kept quiet. Eric suspected Emily simply didn't know what she could say to that information. Was she angry? Scared? Thankful? Because Alora was part of the reason Emma was free now? Seeing no reaction from Emily besides a continued wary gaze, Alora shrugged and continued. Anyway, yeah, if you can't hold on against the onslaught of darkness in your soul, I can offer an easier way. Alora's small, bright red lips curled into a lustful grin as Eric felt her pat the shoulder she was sitting on. Let my partner here take control of you. Become his willing slave and let chains of pleasure and servitude bind your soul in a protective embrace. Eric raised his eyebrows at Alora's proposal, as there was no real need for pleasure to be mentioned. Still, he just let it go, as he knew this was what Alora enjoyed, enticing women to fall into pleasure with her and Eric. Her reaction was one that Eric expected. After all, years of first being a rebellious teen, and then, even if she was corrupted, an enslaver herself had ingrained a deep desire for her own freedom. So Emily instinctively jumped back in fright. What? I'll never be a slave. To anyone. Alora smirked at her defiance and shrugged. Well, if you prefer to be a slave to your darkness, that's fine too. I'll just retake forceful control of you. Your choices are slavery to darkness while puppeteered by me, or enslaved to him while otherwise being yourself. At least with that last choice, you'll be able to interact normally with Emma. Having said her piece, Eric felt Alora's tiny weight disappear from his shoulder, but not before she left behind some final words. Anyway, I'll look on with interest to see what choice you make. After Alora disappeared, Eric saw Emily pan her gaze towards him with apparent hesitation. It seemed as if Alora's words about being enslaved to darkness had struck a chord with the young woman. Eventually, she asked, "See, can you tell me a little more?" Eric couldn't help but smirk at Alora's ability to entice people. Making a deal with Alora was like making a deal with the devil. Unfortunately for Alora, Eric didn't always play along with her half-truths. He nodded. Your situation isn't as grim as she made it seem. Besides the two options Alora mentioned, you do have a third one. Perhaps you haven't noticed yet, but you seem to be doing better already, right? He shrugged. You just need some time to get used to living with this new burden. Find the best ways to resist your darkness and grow your mental fortitude. Use that same aversion to being enslaved by me and keep away the darkness through sheer willpower. Eric had to admit that he didn't really know what Emily was going through, as he had never suffered from corruption. At least, not any negative corruption. Yet he couldn't help but empathize with the girl as he wondered how he would hold up in her situation. Shaking himself free from his thoughts, he uttered some last words as he went to leave. Anyway, I suggest you sleep on a little. Right now, the darkness is scarier because you have only just been freed from it, and it's not a good idea to make any life-changing decision. I won't lock you in here, so you can sleep in your room. Before he could step foot on the stairs, however, he heard Emily call out to him, Wait, just don't tell Emma, all right? Let her believe the purification took care of everything. At least for now. Eric nodded. Don't worry. I had intended the same thing. So Eric left the basement, leaving Emily alone with her thoughts. At the same time, Alora once again scolded him for his bleeding heart. Eric just smiled helplessly and wondered if he and Alora would ever see eye to eye on this kind of thing. Afterward, it didn't take long before Emily left the basement searching for the woman she once knew as Olivia, wanting to determine the truth of her identity and perhaps talk all this through with her. After all, they used to be each other's confidants. Meanwhile, in Emma's room, Eric had decided to check up on her and make sure her magically induced sleep turned into a regular one, so that she would actually be able to rest a little. He woke her up and told her she fell asleep in her sister's arms due to exhaustion. After convincing a reluctant Emma that it was better to wait until the next day to continue catching up with her big sister, Emma requested to be tied up again. Eric naturally did so happily and went to lie down next to Emma, this time intending to actually sleep. While he needed very little rest, he did need at least a little. While there had been a few hours of unconsciousness after he basically fainted following the infusion of the winter wolf bloodline, that could hardly be considered sleep. And with the days he had lately, he could feel exhaustion starting to creep in. Naturally, Alora took the initiative to draw some sigils around the room for protection, since they couldn't exactly trust either Emily or Serafina. When everything was prepared for a good night's rest, Eric drifted off to sleep with two beautiful women in his arms, as Alora had decided to join him. Unfortunately, a good night's rest was not yet in his cards. Instead of the blissful dreamland he was used to, he opened his eyes to find himself floating in a white void. His first reaction was naturally jumping up and preparing for a fight. Still, nothing happened, as the void remained as empty as before. He instinctively reached out to Alora, but although he could still feel his connection with her, there was no reaction from the woman, causing him some anxiety, as this was the first time he couldn't talk to his partner in 7 years. He wondered suspiciously what was happening and felt angry at being toyed with like this. He opened his mouth to yell, "Whoever is doing this, just come out and tell me what you want." Although he couldn't be sure, he suspected that this had something to do with everything else that had happened to him so far. While he had little intention of giving in to whatever demands some strange entity might make of him, he could at least listen to what this was all about. Suddenly, he heard a man's deep voice droning through the white void. "You, plans a Dumla, revenge." Eric frowned as he had no idea what this voice was trying to say, a sentiment he was happy to voice out loud. "What the hell are you talking about?" A response came, "Communication. Hard, recovering, resisting, no time." Eric got a little impatient now and frowned. He realized he was dealing with something likely more powerful than him. Still, he wouldn't just bow down to a disembodied voice that couldn't even talk properly. "If you can't communicate properly, why call me here?" It was silent for a moment, then a response came, "Show passed." Suddenly, the environment changed, and several scenes played before Eric's eyes. As the scene unfolded, a tribe of majestic human-like beings appeared. Eric noticed they were much larger than him. Still, he was unsure whether they were an accurate depiction or if it was simply a consequence of the vision. Aside from being towering figures, they had skin like granite and radiated an aura of primordial power while living seemingly peaceful lives. Yet, he witnessed as this once thriving community met a mysterious end, with each giant succumbing to an inexplicable force, their bodies drying up until they were little more than husks. Amid the fallen giants, a lone figure emerged. He stood amidst his fallen tribesmen and fell to his knees before appearing to roar in despair. As the vision included no sound, Eric heard nothing of this. After appearing to mourn the loss of his tribe for a while longer, the single giant stood up. He walked away, a vision of loneliness, until he was suddenly joined by a woman who could only be described as a female minotaur. The giant had a sword as large and broad as himself on his back, while the woman held a large shield with a one-handed hammer on her hip, with both of them dressed in simple armor. Eric watched them travel various worlds as they appeared to be searching for something, perhaps the reason for his kin's fate. Eric naturally felt sympathy for this giant, as his story was similar. While he knew who had betrayed him, he didn't know why or who this confessor was that his hunters had mentioned that day. He still needed answers, just like this giant. Eventually, the giant seemed to have found an answer, as the vision changed into a colossal tree appearing in the white void, looming over Eric like a cosmic pillar. Its immense trunk of brown bark was adorned with patterns reminiscent of ancient runes and seemed to shimmer slightly. Clusters of leaves spread over its many branches, creating a sprawling green, almost glowing canopy that seemed to cast a shadow on Eric despite no single light source being present. However, it wasn't rooted in the ground. Instead, it floated in the air with its gnarled roots spreading out underneath it like shadowy tendrils. These tendrils seemed connected to various smaller trees, as bits of light appeared to travel through these roots, feeding the large tree. Next, the vision shifted back to the giant from earlier, who was now in a large, seemingly underground complex with a minotaur woman. Surrounding these two were various smaller beings, many of whom looked like regular humans. The pair of Minotaur and Giant seemed to be doing something to these various beings. Still, the exact nature or purpose of their actions remained shrouded in mystery. As the vision unfolded, the current scene suddenly exploded. Three imposing warriors in golden armor appeared in its stead, with an army of winged people behind them. The middle warrior wielded a long spear, the right a simple longsword, and the left had an axe in each hand. What happened next was apocalyptic-level war, as the three beings engaged in an all-out battle with the Giant and the Minotaur, while the winged army engaged with an army of various different races, some of whom Eric recognized as shapeshifters and vampires. After a long battle, the invading force came out victorious. In the final act, the Giant expended his last effort to save the Minotaur woman, who suddenly disappeared in a dark blue flash before the Giant was killed and chopped up into various pieces. Afterwards, the losing army was enslaved, not by the winged creatures, but by many of the same races as had fought against the winged soldiers. Next, the scene changed. The tree was back, and the three golden warriors were standing in front of one of the smaller trees connected to the bigger tree's roots. The spear wielder had a small, see-through orb in his hand and appeared to push it inside the smaller tree. The warriors then left, and time seemed to move forward quickly, indicated by the large leaves swaying frantically. At some point, time moved back to normal speed as the Minotaur woman reappeared and stood next to the same small tree the three warriors had put that orb into. She punched at the tree, and it seemed to disappear, but a green flash hit her in the back before the Minotaur woman did the same. She still disappeared, but by whose hand was uncertain. Then, the vision ended, leaving Eric not much wiser than before, a sentiment he didn't mind sharing. That wasn't very enlightening, you know? What are you trying to tell me? And, more importantly, why should I care? The various goings-on of some random and likely ancient, powerful beings was no concern of Eric. After all he wanted right now was revenge on Edda, including whoever ordered her to do it, and then he would continue with Alora as he had been, grow stronger, and eventually rule together with her, likely starting with Earth. Probably add some more women to their harem, too. Eric was a simple man in that regard. It took a moment for the voice to return as if thinking about something. Still, instead of answering Eric's question, it said something much more interesting. Find revenge, Africa, hunters important. Lastly came a name that caused a flash of rage to pass through Eric's eyes. Edda. Afterward, he suddenly opened his eyes to the real world, staring up at the ceiling as morning light shone through the hole-riddled curtains. He blinked a few times in order to remember where he was, which took a moment since he had just literally watched however many years pass by in vision format. He mumbled, "Way to end on an interesting note." He felt something stir next to him before a slender arm was draped over his chest, followed by the green eyes, crimson hair, and beautiful face of his partner, Elora. "Good morning. What did you just mumble?" Eric sighed. "Let's just say I dreamed something interesting. I'll tell you all about it when I've woken up a little." Elora giggled. I hope it was a sexy dream. Now that they were equal partners, she couldn't look into his memories without his permission anymore. Not that she would if she could. That would be a betrayal of trust, after all. Despite the events just now, Eric couldn't resist laughing at his ever-horny partner. He was glad to have her with him, no matter what the future may hold. Unfortunately not, although there were a man and woman involved. Alora smiled. "Well, I look forward to hearing about it. Anyway, look next to you. That girl you like has a real servile attitude. I approve." Only now did Eric realize that Emma's weight was missing from his left shoulder. He looked at where she was supposed to be and found a plate with some breakfast, including hot coffee. He wondered where Emma had gotten all this stuff from and how she had made coffee, something that Alora quickly explained. Seraphina's travel companions arrived, and they brought all that stuff. Emma woke up earlier and used her light magic to burn through the ropes, binding her, before she went to see what was happening and brought back some breakfast for you. She chuckled. "It's good I added her magical mark to the protection sigils I created, or she might have ended up dead." She shrugged. "Anyway, I suppose she's catching up with her sister now. So how about that dream? Eric nodded and sat upright before taking the breakfast plate and began to share the food with Alora while telling her about everything that happened in the dream. When he was done, Alora looked thoughtful as they continued to eat. When they were done, she sighed. It could mean 100 different things. It seems to suggest that either that giant, the Minotaur, or both are the people who have something to do with the events here on Earth. But that voice you heard might as well have been from one of those golden armored warriors or another person altogether, with the vision being a warning for some reason. Let's focus on that last bit for now. The voice seems to be telling you that Edda and the other hunters are in Africa. So what do you want to do? Eric was quiet for a moment as he thought about that. While part of him wanted to run off to Africa in search of revenge, he couldn't just trust the words of some random voice in his head. Who knew if Edda was truly in Africa? Not to mention that Africa was not exactly a small place. It would have been nice if that voice had been a little more precise. Besides, he wanted to pay a visit to his old community anyway. So he spoke up. We can't simply trust that voice for no reason. Let's just continue as we have been. We're basically done here in London now. We've gained 2 powerful followers and a possible informant in the council. So it's about time we leave. It's time for me to return to my old home. Alora smiled and kissed Eric. Then let's do that. But since they weren't in a hurry, the kissing quickly turned into something more, and it took another hour before Eric left the bedroom with a sated fairy in his soul. He had once again donned his black armor, since today was likely the day they left. At the same time, Emma suddenly came running down the hallway with a worried expression. Still, she seemed to unconsciously brighten up into a relieved smile when she saw Eric's imposing figure. She ran up to him. Sir, can you please come downstairs? Things are heating up. I don't think Seraphina's traveling companions agree with all her decisions so far, and Big M seems about ready to start killing. Hearing about how things were going to shit after just one night of sleeping, Eric couldn't help but sigh. Still, before he asked Emma to lead the way, he had to ask something else. I'll deal with that in a second, Emma. But first, what's up with your outfit? Emma's face started heating up until it was bright red. She looked down and poked her fingers together so cutely that Eric wanted to gobble her up. I figured since I'm supposed to, serve you now that I should probably dress the part. She wasn't kidding, as she was now wearing a surprisingly well-preserved maid dress with a skirt that was perhaps a little shorter than absolutely necessary. She looked up at Eric with sparkling, mismatched eyes. Do you like it? I found it in the room where the maids would dress themselves for work every morning. Eric couldn't help but smile at Emma, while inwardly cursing whatever deity gave her this unfair level of cuteness. He patted her head and caressed her soft white hair. I love it, Emma. You look amazing. The girl, who looked many times better than when Eric had first found her, nuzzled into his hand for a moment, but then remembered why she came here. Ah, sir, the argument. Downstairs. Eric sighed again before indicating for Emma to lead the way. He could already hear the shouting while walking down the stairs. He recognized one voice as Seraphina's. The other was an unknown man's. Currently, the man was yelling something about following protocol and letting a single human stand in her way. Naturally, this man didn't know the many things about Eric that Seraphina now knew, but unfortunately for her, the Covenant would prevent her from sharing any of that. At this point, Eric walked through the doorway and saw 7 people in total. 5 of them knew. Since they were too engrossed in their argument, they hadn't noticed him and Emma yet. So Eric took a moment to survey the room. It was clearly divided into 2 camps, with Seraphina, Emily, and an unknown man on one side, and 2 unknown men and women on the other. One of the opposing unknown men was obviously the leader of the other camp. Alora informed him this man was a second rank, as well as a human, since her senses were much more powerful than Eric's. Emily was sitting on a couch with her elbow on the armrest and her head resting on her fist. She had changed the damaged clothing she'd been wearing during the last 2 days into something new. She now wore a black crop top with similarly colored baggy cargo pants and some chains hanging off her waist. Her black hair flowed freely down her shoulders while her equally black eyes looked at the newcomers with murderous intent. Her other hand was playing with some black orbs dancing around her fingers, clearly ready to attack at a moment's notice. In front of the sofa stood Serafina with her hands on her hips in a domineering manner, while the unknown man, seemingly another vampire, next to her looked anxious and was trying to calm their tensions. Let's just calm down, everyone. Please. We can't fight amongst ourselves. The council will have all our heads if we do that. Sarah, you know he has a point. When you found a second powerful human here, you should have turned around and waited for the rest of us. And Warden Enzo, you can't deny Sarah has a past with this Emily. Anyone will be tempted to bend the rules a little. Besides, didn't it all end for the best? The slaves are freed, and Emily is right there, ready to be taken to the council and judged, as was the plan. Emily scoffed. However, I'm not going anywhere with any of you. Try it and see what happens. The shadows in the room seemed to grow longer the more she talked. When a second-rank human, apparently named Enzo, opened his mouth to answer, Eric figured it was time for him to make an entrance. So he stepped inside the room with a smirk and said, I have to agree with Emily. She's not going anywhere with you because she's coming with me instead. Immediately, various things happened at the same time. Enzo and his group jumped back and prepared themselves for a fight under Eric's amused gaze. Meanwhile, the man next to Serafina looked at him with undisguised hostility, while Serafina looked at him with annoyance and hunger, clearly unhappy with her inability to talk about anything related to Eric while also feeling her desire for his blood grow. Lastly, Emily looked at him with a mix of gratitude, suspicion, and confusion. She was also the first to talk. I haven't decided if I want to follow you yet. Eric shrugged. Well, I won't force you. I just figured since Emma is coming with me. Emily looked surprised now and panned her gaze to Emma, standing just behind Eric, little Em. While Emily and Emma had already taken some time to talk to each other, and Emily had also spent a long time talking to Serafina during the night, the fact was that both Emma and Serafina were still bound by the covenant not to talk about Eric, so Emily still knew disturbingly little about the man, or his deals with her sister and her old friend. Emma nodded, a little uncomfortable, not because she didn't want to follow or serve Eric, but because she didn't want to leave behind her big sister. That was the deal I made, Big Em. She quickly shook her hands, but I don't mind. Sir treats me well. He gave me power, and he helped me to help you. This is a small price to pay. She looked pleadingly at Emily. Please come with us, Big Em. I know you're afraid of hurting me again, but you won't. I know you won't. We already purified you, after all. Emma was still unaware that Emily was constantly struggling with herself to stave off the darkness inside her. Emily looked guilty and started saying something. I dashed, but was immediately interrupted by the man named Enzo. Enough of this. None of this matters. He pointed at Emily. You are coming with us to face judgment. And then swiveled his finger towards Eric. And you are coming too. All second and third rank figures must register themselves with the council. But we have no record of you. Not to mention that you need to stand trial for harboring a fugitive and the disappearance of the local warlord. Then he pointed to Serafina, for which you also need to be questioned, by the way. Lastly, he waved his hand in dismissal. As for the Emma girl, I don't care. She can come with us or stay here. Either way, the council has no business with her. During his tirade, Serafina palmed her face at Enzo's behavior. At the same time, Eric just looked at him with amusement, wondering where he was getting all this confidence from as a mere second rank. At the same time, Emma slipped past Eric and started talking with Emily in hushed tones. Regardless, Eric had no interest in dealing with any of this in a civil manner, so he crossed his arms, raised an eyebrow, and formed his lips into an amused smirk. And how exactly are you going to stop me? Enzo snorted. You may have beaten Serafina 2 days ago, but I won't be so easy. Besides, do you really think Serafina will betray the council? You'll have to fight the both of us, while Emily is just an enslaver without any slaves. Hearing his words, Serafina sighed. Ignoring the part about being harder to beat than her, he was somewhat correct about the rest. Serafina had no inherent problem with fighting Eric and taking the 2 sisters to the council, since she had already made arrangements for them. Yet, she was conflicted. She knew Emma would prefer to stay with Eric, while Emily apparently had some problems that Eric and Alora were better suited to solve than the council was. But she wasn't sure if her decision even mattered, as she suspected Eric was not an opponent they could face. And she was right. With his dual paths of Arcanist and Runebound, fighting two second ranks wouldn't be too much of a problem for him. Yet, he would prefer not to, setting aside the fact that Emma, as a mere first rank, might end up hurt. He would also like to keep his uniqueness a secret for now. After all, the council, at the very least, had multiple third-rank counselors. It was best for Eric and Alora to stay clear until they were stronger by not giving them too much reason to give chase. Besides, Alora had long since prepared for many eventualities. So Eric simply laughed heartily at Enzo's words, as if he had just heard the funniest joke in a long time before he lifted his foot and stomped on the ground. His actions caused a large, light purple sigil to be activated, encircling the entire room as it fizzled and cracked with lightning. Serafina and Enzo both yelled, "What are you got?" They were cut off as screams began to fill the room when nearly everyone received a heavy electric shock under Eric's indifferent gaze. The newly arrived rank ones were all knocked out in an instant. Meanwhile, Emma and Emily were spared, while Enzo and Serafina were shocked but remained conscious due to their higher strength. Serafina was in better condition than Enzo because of her rune-bound body, but they both panted heavily and sank to one knee while looking resentfully at Eric. Eric walked over to Enzo with a shrug. "I generally don't enjoy resorting to these things, as there are few things I love more than a good fight, but sometimes you have no other choice, you know?" All this pussyfooting around was getting tiresome for Eric. He enjoyed fighting, and back on Sol, he could do it as much as he liked because it was a large world, and Eric could simply move to another place if he pissed off a local ruler. Not to mention that violence was much more common there. But here, he had to be careful of the council for now. He crouched before the panting man, who stared at him with fury and spat on the ground in front of Eric. "I don't know how you did that, but you won't get away with it." He grinned. "Just wait until the Iron Sentinel gets here." Eric groaned in annoyance before using his heavily armored gauntlet to knock the man out. "Just stay quiet." He turned to Serafina. Who was this Iron Sentinel he spoke of? While they had gained a lot of information about the council from Serafina, the internal workings of the Shadow Sentinels were not part of it. Unfortunately, this information fell under the no sharing of information that could hurt her clause of their deal. Thanks to her powerful body, Serafina had already largely recovered and struggled to reach her feet. She growled, Fuck you. You didn't have tea to attack me, too." Eric grinned. "Come now, I could see your eyes. You were ready to fight me together with that guy." "Honestly, Serafina, I thought we got along so well." The vampire rolled her eyes as she struggled to control her wounded body. "Did you forget how you left me tied up in lightning chains next to your bed for a night?" Eric chuckled. All right. How about a peace offering?" He bit his finger, making blood flow, and brought it closer to Serafina's face. "Here, this will help you recover." Immediately, Eric saw hunger replace every other thought in the vampire's mind as her gaze fixed itself on the bleeding finger. It was only a moment before she instinctively lurched forward and sucked it into her mouth. As she drank Eric's blood, she once again felt like liquid heaven was streaming down her throat while power filled every fiber of her being. She recognized the danger in continuing to drink this. She hated herself for being so weak, but her instincts refused to let her stop. Eric spoke soothingly, patting her silky black hair. There. It's all right. Let me take care of you." While he didn't want Serafina to become entirely dependent on him, he needed to make himself more important than the council. And for now, he had no other way than his blood. Emily and Emma looked at this display in morbid fascination, especially Emily, who had never seen her old friend act like that. Eric eventually pulled his finger back, causing Serafina to attempt to follow, but was held back by the other hand. Now, your wounds are healed. You don't need my blood anymore, unless you would like to ask for some more." Quickly recovering her sanity, Serafina growled, Fuck you. I know what you're doing." Eric shrugged in response. "Well, suit yourself. If you'd like some more of my blood, how about trading it for information on that Iron Sentinel?" Seeing her withering stare was the only response he was going to get. Eric shrugged again and turned towards Emily instead. Despite his cavalier attitude, he knew he needed to make a little haste, as there was a good chance this Iron Sentinel was a third-rank counselor. Now, looking at Emily, it was time to confirm her future plans. Well, it appears the time to make a choice is here. Will you come with me and Emma, or take your chances with Serafina and the council? I should remind you that I expect you to follow my lead and swear a covenant if you come with us. Despite asking the question, he knew there was only one possible answer. And a good thing, too. Otherwise, he would have had to let Alora take control of Emily again. After all, Emily knew too much already and, unlike Serafina, was not bound by covenant. No matter what, he couldn't let Emily leave for the council despite saying earlier he wouldn't force her to follow him. Emily looked uncertain for a split second, but sighed. Was it ever really a question? Of course, I'm following Emma wherever she goes. She conveniently left out the part about likely needing more treatments in the future. She stepped closer to Eric and poked his chest with her finger, saying words that confused Emma a little. I'll follow your orders while we travel together, but I won't take your little friend's deal for now. She hesitated a moment, but keep it ready just in case. Eric felt his respect for Emily rise as he smiled and nodded. As Emily continued to poke Eric's chest, her following words made Emma sad. Just remember, you have my loyalty only so long as you have Emma's, and so long as you keep her safe no matter what. Even for me. When Emily was about to turn around and address Serafina, Eric stopped her, saying, that's not good enough. He didn't know how much time he had, but some things couldn't wait. Emily frowned and turned back. What? Eric stuck out his hand, and dark green energy swirled in the familiar way by which he and Alora created their covenants. You see, Serafina and Emma have both sworn covenants to keep my secrets, and I need you to do the same. Think of it like a magical contract. Emily looked at Eric's arm with skepticism before turning to Emma, who nodded with a happy smile, glad that Emily was coming with them. Still skeptical, Emily looked back at Eric. So what are the terms exactly? I'll give you the same deal I gave Emma. Serve me for 10 years, non-sexually, and never tell anyone anything about me. They don't know yet without my permission, he answered. Emily snorted. And what do I get in exchange? To which Eric raised an eyebrow. Everything I've done for you so far wasn't good enough? Emily recoiled a little and had to admit he had a point. Yet, the serving part still made her balk. So what if I refuse? Instead of Eric, the one who answered was Alora. Emily suddenly heard a loud giggle echoing in her head, followed by a voice she recognized. You and I are still connected, Emily. The fact is, I can take control of you whenever I like, and Eric and I can't afford for you to go back to the council with everything you know about us. So accept the deal, or become a puppet again. Your choice. Emily paled at the thought of Alora simply taking over whenever she wished. She gulped and looked at Eric with a little fear. I will take your deal, but only if that little woman relinquishes any and all control or connection she still has with me. Hearing her words, Eric engaged in a short debate with Alora, but eventually convinced her. So he grinned and nodded. Deal. He wasn't interested in turning the woman into a puppet again anyway. They shook hands, and the magic did its work as small marks appeared on both their hands. Yet, the one on Eric's hand disappeared almost immediately after Alora had released her control over Emily. When this happened, Emily felt a chain unwind from her soul, which she had never even realized had been there, causing her to sigh in relief. Now, looking at Emily, it was time to confirm her future plans. Well, it appears the time to make a choice is here. Will you come with me and Emma, or take your chances with Serafina and the council? I should remind you that I expect you to follow my lead and swear a covenant if you come with us. Despite asking the question, he knew there was only one possible answer. And a good thing, too. Otherwise, he would have had to let Alora take control of Emily again. After all, Emily knew too much already and, unlike Serafina, was not bound by covenant. No matter what, he couldn't let Emily leave for the council despite saying earlier he wouldn't force her to follow him. Emily looked uncertain for a split second, but sighed. Was it ever really a question? Of course. I'm following Emma wherever she goes. She conveniently left out the part about likely needing more treatments in the future. She stepped closer to Eric and poked his chest with her finger, saying words that confused Emma a little. I'll follow your orders while we travel together, but I won't take your little friend's deal for now. She hesitated a moment, but keep it ready just in case. Eric felt his respect for Emily rise as he smiled and nodded. As Emily continued to poke Eric's chest, her following words made Emma sad. Just remember, you have my loyalty only so long as you have Emma's, and so long as you keep her safe no matter what. Even for me. When Emily was about to turn around and address Serafina, Eric stopped her, saying, that's not good enough. He didn't know how much time he had, but some things couldn't wait. Emily frowned and turned back. What? Eric stuck out his hand, and dark green energy swirled in the familiar way by which he and Alora created their covenants. You see, Serafina and Emma have both sworn covenants to keep my secrets, and I need you to do the same. Think of it like a magical contract. Emily looked at Eric's arm with skepticism before turning to Emma, who nodded with a happy smile, glad that Emily was coming with them. Still skeptical, Emily looked back at Eric. So what are the terms exactly? I'll give you the same deal I gave Emma. Serve me for 10 years, non-sexually, and never tell anyone anything about me. They don't know yet without my permission, he answered. Emily snorted. And what do I get in exchange? To which Eric raised an eyebrow. Everything I've done for you so far wasn't good enough? Emily recoiled a little and had to admit he had a point. Yet, the serving part still made her balk. So what if I refuse? Instead of Eric, the one who answered was Alora. Emily suddenly heard a loud giggle echoing in her head, followed by a voice she recognized. You and I are still connected, Emily. The fact is, I can take control of you whenever I like, and Eric and I can't afford for you to go back to the council with everything you know about us. So accept the deal, or become a puppet again. Your choice. Emily paled at the thought of Alora simply taking over whenever she wished. She gulped and looked at Eric with a little fear. I will take your deal, but only if that little woman relinquishes any and all control or connection she still has with me. Hearing her words, Eric engaged in a short debate with Alora, but eventually convinced her. So he grinned and nodded. Deal. He wasn't interested in turning the woman into a puppet again anyway. They shook hands, and the magic did its work as small marks appeared on both their hands. Yet, the one on Eric's hand disappeared almost immediately after Alora had released her control over Emily. When this happened, Emily felt a chain unwind from her soul, which she had never even realized had been there, causing her to sigh in relief. Still feeling relieved from losing her connection to Alora, Emily turned to Serafina with an apologetic expression. You know, it's not about you, right? I trust you to have my back with the council, but I have a lot to make up for with Emma, and I won't run from that responsibility, even if I'm afraid to hurt her again. Although that wasn't the only reason she had decided to follow Eric, she didn't want to mention the darkness that continued to corrupt her soul with Emma there. Serafina knew about it. However, despite Eric ignoring her, the vampires still looked at him with annoyed hunger and fury. Still, hearing Emily's words, she tore her gaze away and looked at the pale, dark-haired woman. She nodded and sighed. I know, but just as I told your sister, I hope you made the right choice. After today, the council will label all 3 of you as fugitives. Hearing her words, Emma smiled happily. Don't worry, we'll be fine. She approached the vampire woman and hugged her tightly. Don't think too badly about Eric, all right? He may not treat you as well as he should, but he has done very well by me and Emily. Surely that counts for something. Eric would have cheered and hugged Emma if that hadn't ruined the moment. He had been treating Serafina harshly to humble her a little while feeding her his blood to make her desire him. But he had been counting on his treatment of the sisters to make him seem like a better person in Serafina's eyes and perhaps even want the same treatment for herself. Emma's words couldn't have fit better within those plans. The vampire woman looked at Emma's sincere eyes and matching smile for a moment before sighing and realizing Emma was right. While Eric had been harsh on her, she, too, had been both antagonistic and suspicious the whole time she was here. Perhaps she simply wanted to be the one to save these sisters and didn't like someone else showing up to do the job instead. Maybe she was also a little scared of how good Eric's blood tasted and how it made her feel. She looked at Emily, wondering about her old friend's opinion on the matter, but the pale woman just shrugged. I don't know him that well yet, but I can't help but give him some points for what he's done so far. Eric looked at Serafina, wondering about her next actions when they suddenly heard a loud, chopping sound approaching them from afar. Eric, Emma, and Emily had trouble recognizing it, but Serafina didn't. She gained a complicated look in her eyes, but seemed to make a decision before turning to Eric. That is likely the Lord Commander's helicopter. She is a third-rank, bear-type shapeshifter who loves fighting and prefers to do so with her hands and claws rather than a weapon. Her name is Katia Ironova. Other than that, her affinity is metal, and she usually travels alone, even flying the helicopter herself, but that is all I know about her. Now, please knock me out so she doesn't suspect anything. Eric immediately cursed inwardly. He had taken too long. On the one hand, he was excited about the possibility of fighting a third rank, something he had done only once before. On the other, he knew he had very little chance of beating her, yet he couldn't let himself be taken to the council. Who knew when he would be able to leave again? If ever? He refused to let his and Alora's fate be in the hands of others. Regardless, it had been only about 5 to 10 minutes since he was told this Iron Sentinel was even coming in the first place. He wondered if he would have been able to get far enough away to be safe from a helicopter in that amount of time. His conclusion? Probably not. Not even if he had left the Ashcroft sisters behind. He didn't like running and hiding anyway, so perhaps this was for the best. He and Alora quickly began brainstorming ideas as the thunderous whirring of rotating blades slicing through the air came ever closer. A few moments later, Alora and Eric reached a consensus. Eric quickly removed his armor, leaving him in the simple tunic and pants he had worn the day before. He handed it to Emily and Emma before giving them some instructions. Keeping his armor and the things inside its storage compartment hidden from this third rank was a high priority, even if he had to fight her without it. He did keep his hammer with him, of course. There wasn't anything exciting about it anyway. Next, he pushed a few vials of blood into Serafina's hands. These are his thanks for sharing what you know about this Katia woman. Now, I won't knock you out because I need you to play along. It's for the sisters' sake, but I won't lie. You might be incriminated. That said, I suspect you have a powerful enough background that you'd be able to talk your way out of it, correct? Serafina nodded, but still looked uncertain. Luckily, it didn't take much convincing to get Serafina to help since she recognized the situation's urgency. He explained what he needed her to do. When she indicated her understanding, he moved towards the estate's garden, where he had previously fought Serafina. The helicopter had, by now, reached the Ashcroft estate and was hovering overhead. On the side of it was a pale woman with light brown hair and a large grin, seemingly surveying the surroundings. When she noticed Eric, her grin grew even wider. She seemed to disappear inside the machine momentarily before it moved over the garden and began landing. But the same woman from earlier, presumably the Iron Sentinel, Katia, suddenly jumped down while the helicopter was still descending. Eric looked in amazement as he saw the woman descend from a terrifying height, defying gravity with supernatural grace as her long ponytail flickered behind her. With a thunderous impact, she landed on the garden's soil, her powerful legs absorbing the shock and creating a small crater beneath her. Dust and grass swirled in the air as she straightened, a towering and imposing presence amid a previously peaceful garden. Eric had to admit that, while powerful, his body would not survive such a fall. Yet he also suspected this wouldn't be normal for third-rank Runebound, as he knew bear-type shapeshifters had some of the densest bodies in the supernatural world. As Eric looked curiously at this woman, he noticed her sharp, blue eyes scanning the surroundings with an air of casual arrogance and a playful smirk on her lips. He was surprised to find this woman only a little shorter than him, something he rarely encountered but didn't find unattractive. In fact, this Katia was a mature beauty with high cheekbones and a slender nose. She was dressed in a simple white crop top which fit snugly around her medium-sized chest and left the well-defined muscles of her powerful arms and the clear six-pack of her stomach out in the open air. Her legs were covered by brown cargo pants, while her feet were bare. Most shapeshifters would leave their feet bare since it took too long to remove their shoes when they wanted to shift, assuming they even took the time to take off their clothes. Her attire was somewhat similar to Emily's. Still, Eric would think of the military with Katia, while Emily's clothes made him think of an edgy adventurer. When she was done looking around, Katia honed in on Eric. She walked towards him with purposeful yet casual strides while observing him. Eric made it a point to look unintimidated and even eager, which wasn't hard, as that was precisely how he felt. Sure, she was stronger than him, but that only made him more excited. And while he couldn't deny he was a little intimidated, his pride and excitement wiped that feeling out as soon as it appeared. As Katia approached Eric, the helicopter had finished landing not far behind Katia, likely on some sort of autopilot. She stood a few meters before Eric with her arms crossed, looking him up and down with a curious smile. Meanwhile, Eric did the same thing. After all, he had to awaken this woman's love for fighting. Katia spoke up, grinning. "You must be the human that waylaid the Nightshade girl. I like the look in your eyes, but what is a human like you doing with a hammer like that?" It seems Eric and Alora's assumption was correct. This Iron Sentinel knew very little about his fight with Serafina, something they could use to their advantage, even if Katia later finds out the truth. Eric grinned back. "Who said I was a human? I just didn't need my full strength to beat that little vampire." With those words, he quickly shifted, ripping apart his few clothes. Less than a second of creaking, cracking, and ripping later, the human Eric had been replaced by a werewolf with beautiful white fur interlaced with black marks in the shape of lightning bolts, a combination of his winter wolf and Reiju bloodlines. He planted the head of his hammer on the ground. "But for you, I'll get serious. Katia Ironova, third-rank runebound, the Iron Sentinel, and leader of the European Council's peacekeeping force, the Shadow Sentinels, watched with curiosity and surprise at Eric's transformation. At the same time, she cooed, "Ooh, you're a fellow shapeshifter, nice." When he was done and made his declaration, she couldn't help laughing. "I like you. You got spunk. But while it's impressive you managed to beat the vampire girl in your human form, beating me will be another matter entirely. Are you sure you're up for it?" Eric's wolfish lips curled into a grin. "Couldn't hurt to try, right? Either way, I'm not one to run from a good fight." Katia's blue eyes showed a glint of appreciation and cunning. "You know, if I couldn't see the conviction in your eyes, I might think you're trying to play me." She wasn't an idiot, after all. Eric shrugged. Why can't it be both? He didn't see a point in trying to lie about his intentions. She laughed again. It was a burst of belly-type laughter that you didn't often find in women, but Eric didn't mind that. In fact, Katia seemed like a woman he would get along with. Regardless, they were on opposite sides for now. When she was done laughing, her eyes gained an intense focus, clearly readying herself for a fight. "I suppose that means the Ashcroft sisters are currently fleeing. Fine, little pup. If you want to fight, I'll give you one. I don't much care about this Emily girl, anyway." She grinned widely. "But if you actually want these girls to get away, you'll probably need to entertain me for at least 30 minutes. Think you're up to the task." Eric's most crucial part of the plan was delaying Katia for a while, ensuring she didn't simply attempt to rush past him inside the mansion or after the sisters. Not that he was doing all this for the sisters. While Eric could certainly admit to caring about the sisters, Serafina had already made arrangements, so their fate in the council wouldn't be so bad. Instead, he did this mainly because this plan would give the highest chance for his and Alora's survival and freedom. So he matched her grin with excited determination. "Absolutely I do." The Iron Sentinel chuckled at his enthusiasm. "Fine. But before we start, tell me the situation inside. It will determine my treatment of you after I beat you up a little." Assuming she was talking about her subordinates, Eric shrugged. "They're all fine, just unconscious in the living room. Serafina and Enzo included." This time, Katia truly looked surprised. "Oh? You knocked 2 second-rankers unconscious without bringing the house down around you? If true, then I would really like to know how you did that." Grinning because he had once again increased Kadia's interest in him, he said, "Maybe you'll be able to find out." Kadia snorted, "You've already completed your goal of gaining my interest, pup. There's no need to continue acting so mysteriously." She spread her arms and smirked. "And anyway, you'll tell me all I wish to know soon enough. Now, give me your best shot. Let's see if you do better against me than Serafina did against you. Let's see if a second rank can force me to shift." While Eric was a little annoyed by her stance, he could understand the sentiment. Since he couldn't delay any longer, Eric decided to just enjoy himself. With a grin, he picked up his hammer and touched one of his lightning runes, causing light purple markings and sparks of lightning to appear all over his skin. This was the same skill he used to win his bet against Alora 2 nights ago, only on much higher intensity. It flooded his body with electricity, making it harmful for anyone to touch him while increasing his reflexes and speed. Kadia cooed, "Ooh, lightning, aren't you lucky? Perhaps you'll actually be able to penetrate my defenses then." Certain affinities had some advantages against others, like lightning against metal. Still, the impact of these advantages would decrease exponentially as the power ceiling increased. With an excited grin and hammer in hand, Eric charged at Kadia. He first approached with a side wipe, aiming to hit her with the flat side of his hammer. The woman mirrored his grin when a thin metallic sheen covered her right hand. Next, she backhanded the approaching hammer, easily making it fly off course before she closed on Eric and punched him heavily in the stomach. Coughing and only barely able to hold on to his hammer, Eric flew back a few meters before stabilizing himself. Eric wasn't deterred despite eating a big loss in their first exchange. Instead, his grin only got more excited. He knew it would be this way from the start. After all, Kadia's body was the strongest he had ever fought against. Kadia chuckled as she observed Eric's resilience. She might actually enjoy this fight, as it had been a while since a second rank piqued her interest. She flexed her metallic-covered hand and beckoned Eric to come at her again. Eric, undeterred, lunged forward, his movements quickened by the coursing electricity that enveloped him. This time, he charged his hammer with the same concussive lightning blast he used against Serafina. He wasn't afraid of revealing he had more skills and spells than he was supposed to, since his goal was to increase Kadia's interest in him without giving away too much. But the Iron Sentinel was no ordinary opponent. She swiftly dodged Eric's attack, showcasing her surprising agility. Yet her dodge was not good enough. The concussive blast exploded, somewhat surprising Kadia, as these kinds of attacks were not standard for Runebound. Yet, they did appear, so she quickly shook off her surprise in the blast before retaliating with a swift kick to Eric's side. This time, she encased her leg in a metal sheen. The impact sent him sprawling, but he managed to roll and regain his footing. Kadia grinned. "Not bad, pup. You surprised me with that one. But you'll have to do better." From this point, Eric kept attacking, as Kadia continued to defend and retaliate, apparently refusing to go on the offensive. Eric didn't care. He enjoyed the chance to go all out against a seemingly insurmountable foe. As the fight continued, Kadia seemed to become increasingly impressed with Eric's abilities and eventually even began giving him tips. "Remember, pup," Kadia called out, "speed isn't just about moving quickly. It's about being unpredictable." It was a good tip for Eric, who wasn't used to relying on his speed. Usually, he was the one with the more powerful body, even when he once fought a third-rank Arcanist back on Sol. The unfortunate fact was that back on Sol, he'd never had a real teacher, as no one could know the full extent of his uniqueness. His entire fighting style was self-taught with Alora's help. Only his hammer technique was partly taught by someone else. It wasn't long before Eric began showing off his other skills and spells. At one point, Eric saw an opening. When he was about to be kicked in the side again, he stood his ground instead of purposefully moving with the force to reduce the impact. Kadia was surprised, but didn't reduce the power of her kick. When it connected, she didn't hit the expected fur and flesh, but a small layer of ice that quickly shattered but gave Eric the time he needed to launch an attack. He opened his mouth wide and howled as an icy blue magic circle appeared, releasing a powerful blast of icy shrapnel straight into the Iron Sentinel's face. Katia yelped in surprise and was just barely able to cross her arms in front of her face before the attack hit, and she slid back across the ground a few meters. When she stabilized, her face showed a grin while she shook her arms to remove any remaining ice. There were no wounds, as her arms had been encased in metal. She looked with amusement and surprise towards Eric. A second affinity? And you managed to bring it to the second rank as well? Nice going, pup. The surprise attack was well executed, too. His ice affinity was actually still in the first rank, but he simply gained one ability each for his Arcanist and Runebound paths. Eric grinned. Thank you, but I still haven't even put a scratch on you. Katia chuckled. I like your attitude. Come on then, keep trying. Eric attacked again, a feral smile adorning his wolfish lips. They continued to fight for at least an hour as Katia gave Eric tips while he improved with leaps and bounds. He realized the benefits a good teacher could have on his fighting style, and here on Earth, he could have a teacher without hiding his shapeshifter side. It was a shame his revenge took precedence in his mind. Otherwise, he might have tried to get this Katia woman to take him under her wing. And if that led to a more intimate relationship, well, he couldn't deny the idea of having a different kind of battle with this powerful, mature beauty was an interesting one.